26th, 1986, 1:23 a.m., Chernobyl nuclear power plant, reactor number 4. The explosion happens in less than a second. Not a bomb, not a missile. The reactor itself tears apart from the inside. The roof of the building is gone. 2 men die immediately. The night shift doesn't know what they're looking at. Nobody does, because nothing like this has ever happened before. Inside the control room, seconds after the explosion, the instruments are wrong, every single one. The needles are pinned. The displays show numbers that are physically impossible. Operators stare at the panels and start pressing buttons, resetting switches, trying to make the readings make sense. They can't, because the readings are correct. The reactor core has been destroyed, and right now, beneath the rubble, something is still happening. Something that will take 3 days for the Soviet government to partially understand, and decades for the rest of the world to fully grasp. What actually happened? Reactor number 4 was running a safety test, a test that had been delayed, rushed, and handed to the wrong shift at the wrong time. The operators followed a flawed procedure. The reactor design had a defect that Soviet engineers knew about and had not fixed. When the conditions aligned, the power spiked. In 3 seconds, the reactor went from operational to critical. The steam explosion that followed blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid straight up through the roof. The graphite core was now exposed to open air. It was burning, and it would burn for 10 days. The fire. Firefighters arrive within minutes. They are told it is an ordinary fire. They are not told what they are walking toward. They climb onto the roof of the reactor building to fight the flames from above. Some of them pick up chunks of glowing graphite with their bare hands, not knowing what it is. By morning, the most exposed firefighters are vomiting in the parking lot. Within 2 weeks, 28 of them will be dead. Their bodies so contaminated they have to be buried in sealed zinc coffins. Valery Legasov, Soviet nuclear physicist, deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute. He is 49 years old. He has spent his entire career inside Soviet nuclear science. He is not a politician. He is not a general. He is a scientist who understands exactly what a destroyed reactor means. When he arrives at Chernobyl on April 26th, he is one of the first people in the Soviet Union to say out loud what everyone else is trying not to think. This is not a fire. This is a catastrophe, and it is not over. The problem nobody wants to say. Beneath reactor number 4 is a massive water reservoir. It is part of the reactor's cooling system. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, sitting directly below a melting nuclear core. The core is burning at over 2,000 degrees. It is eating through the concrete floor of the reactor building, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, day by day. If the molten core reaches that water, the result is a steam explosion. The estimates vary. Some Soviet scientists calculate it would be equivalent to 3 to 5 megatons, enough to destroy the other 3 Chernobyl reactors, enough to contaminate the water supply for half of Europe, enough to make Kiev, a city of 3 million people, permanently uninhabitable. This is not a theory. This is physics, and the clock is running. May 1986, the first week after the explosion. The Soviets are fighting the fire from above, dropping sand and boron from helicopters. The pilots are flying directly over an open reactor core. Some of them will develop cancers within years. The fire slows but does not stop. The core keeps burning, and below the building, the water is still there. Nobody has drained it. Nobody knows how. The pipes are blocked. The valves are underwater. The water level in the reservoir cannot be measured because the instruments near it have all failed from radiation. Someone has to go in. Someone has to open the valves manually from inside the flooded basement of a destroyed nuclear reactor, the basement of reactor number 4. The lower levels of the reactor building are flooded, not with ordinary water, with reactor coolant water, now heavily contaminated with radioactive particles from the destroyed core. It is dark. The lights are gone. The water is knee-deep in some sections, waist-deep in others. The radiation levels in the basement are high enough that spending 30 minutes inside means absorbing more radiation than a human body is supposed to receive in an entire lifetime. Nobody knows the exact levels, because no instrument that has been sent down there has come back with a readable number. The dosimeters max out and stop measuring. This is where the valves are. This is where someone has to go. The volunteers? 3 men step forward. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, Boris Baranov. Ananenko is a senior engineer at the plant. He knows where the valves are. He has worked in that basement. He knows the layout in darkness. Bespalov is a shift foreman. Baranov is a pump station operator. They are not soldiers. They are not a special forces team. They are plant workers. Men who came to their jobs on an ordinary April night and ended up inside the worst nuclear accident in human history. When they are asked to go into the basement, they know what the radiation down there will do to a human body. They say yes anyway. Why they went? Nobody ordered them at gunpoint. That is a myth that gets repeated and needs to be corrected. They were asked. Volunteers were requested. And these 3 men volunteered. Why? Ananenko would say later that it was simple. He knew where the valves were. Nobody else did. If someone had to go, it was going to be him. Bespalov and Baranov went because they were his colleagues. Because you don't send one man into a flooded, contaminated reactor basement alone. That is the kind of logic that sounds small when you say it out loud. It is the kind of logic that saves millions of people. May 1986, night, the preparation. They are given wetsuits. Dosimeters that everyone knows will stop reading before they reach the worst areas. Waterproof flashlights, a map of the basement layout that Ananenko draws from memory because the original blueprints are somewhere in an office that no longer exists. They are given no promises about what will happen to them afterward. The Soviet system does not make promises in moments like this. They put on their suits. They pick up the flashlights. They walk to the entrance of the flooded basement. The entrance to the basement. The water begins at the bottom of the stairwell. Black water, not moving. The flashlight beams disappear into it. The dosimeters begin clicking immediately and the rate is wrong. Too fast. The readings are already approaching the upper limit and they haven't moved yet. They step in. The water is cold. It reaches their knees, then their thighs. The floor is not visible. Ananenko leads because he knows where to go. Bespalov and Baranov follow. The darkness is total, except for the flashlight beams cutting through murky water ahead of them. Inside the flooded basement, the basement of reactor number 4, is a maze of corridors, pipes, and equipment rooms. In normal conditions, with lights, it takes 20 minutes to navigate to the pump room where the valves are. In flooded darkness, with failing dosimeters, in water of unknown depth and contamination, the same route becomes something else entirely. They move slowly, testing the floor ahead with each step. The water level changes without warning as the floor rises and falls. In some sections, it drops to their ankles. In others, it rises to their chests. They do not turn back. The valve room. Ananenko finds it. He knows this room. He has been here before, in daylight, when the reactor was running and the basement was dry and this was just his workplace. Now he stands in contaminated water in the dark with a flashlight pointed at the valve wheels he came to turn. The valves are manual, large wheels mounted on the pipes. They require physical strength to turn. He turns the first one, then the second, then Bespalov and Baranov help with the third. The valves open. The water begins to drain. The mission, the thing they came to do, the thing the world needed them to do, is done. They walk back out. They survive the immediate mission. This is the part the story usually gets wrong. The 3 men do not die in the basement. They walk out. They are taken to hospital immediately. Their radiation exposure is serious. Ananenko and Bespalov receive doses that will affect their health for the rest of their lives. Baranov the same, but they survive the mission itself. They are not dead within days or weeks. The myth that they died heroically within days, which spread widely in the years after Chernobyl, is not accurate. What happened to them is more complicated and in some ways more human. What happened to them after? Alexei Ananenko continued working in the nuclear industry. Valery Bespalov, the same. Both men have spoken publicly about Chernobyl in the decades since. Boris Baranov died in 2005, at the age of 65, of causes that his family has not attributed publicly to radiation. None of the three died in the days or weeks immediately after the mission. The heroic story that circulates, the one where all three died shortly after to save the world, is not what happened. What happened is that three ordinary men did an extraordinary thing and then went back to their lives as best they could, which is its own kind of story. Why the drain mattered. When the valves opened and the water began to drain from the reservoir beneath reactor number 4, the countdown to a potential steam explosion stopped. The molten core continued burning downward through the concrete for days afterward, but when it reached the level where the water had been, there was no water. The reservoir was empty. The steam explosion did not happen. The chain reaction that Soviet scientists had calculated would destroy the other 3 reactors and contaminate the water supply for half of Europe did not happen. It did not happen because 3 men walked into a flooded basement in the dark and turned some valves. The helicopter pilots, while Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov were below the reactor, hundreds of men were above it. Soviet military helicopter pilots flew over the open core for days, dropping materials to slow the fire. Each pass over the reactor exposed them to radiation levels that were difficult to measure and impossible to protect against adequately. Many of these pilots developed serious health problems in the years that followed. They were not asked if they volunteered. They were told where to fly. They flew. The liquidators. Over the following months and years, approximately 600,000 Soviet workers and soldiers were sent to Chernobyl to clean up the disaster. They are called liquidators. They worked in shifts, sometimes for only 90 seconds at a time, on the most contaminated surfaces, because that was the maximum safe exposure the Soviet system had calculated. Some were given proper protective equipment, many were not. Some received accurate information about what they were being sent into. Many did not. The exact long-term health effects on the liquidator population are still debated by scientists today because the Soviet record-keeping was inconsistent and much of it was classified. The scale of what almost happened. Legasov and other Soviet scientists calculated after the event that if the steam explosion had occurred, the fallout radius would have reached not just Ukraine, but Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, and potentially further. The contamination of the Dnieper River, which flows from the Chernobyl region to the Black Sea, would have made drinking water unsafe across a vast portion of Eastern Europe for years. The evacuation that actually happened, 350,000 people removed from the exclusion zone, would have been the smallest part of the displacement. Cities would have been abandoned. Borders would have been irrelevant. The word catastrophe does not cover it. The English language does not have a ready word for what could have happened. What Legasov said afterward. Valery Legasov spent the 2 years after Chernobyl fighting the Soviet system. He testified at the International Inquiry in Vienna in 1986, giving the world its first detailed account of what had happened. He was more honest than the Soviet government wanted him to be. He named design flaws. He named institutional failures. He named the culture of secrecy that had allowed a reactor with a known defect to keep operating. When he returned to Moscow, his career was effectively over. He was passed over for awards that went to other men. His reports were ignored. He recorded his testimony on audio tapes, hiding the recordings in his apartment. April the 27th, 1988, Moscow. Exactly 2 years after the Chernobyl explosion, Valery Legasov took his own life. He was 51 years old. The audio tapes were found in his apartment after his death. They were eventually made public. They contained everything he had tried to tell the Soviet system and been ignored. After his death, he was awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation, posthumously, the highest civilian honor the country gives. It came 2 years too late. The exclusion zone today. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl still exists. Pripyat, the city built specifically for the workers of the nuclear plant, population 50,000, was evacuated in the 36 hours after the explosion. The residents were told to bring documents and food for 3 days. Most of them never went back. The apartment buildings are still standing. The school is still there. The amusement park, which was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986, 5 days after the explosion, never opened. The Ferris wheel is still there. It has never been ridden. What the reactor looks like now, reactor number 4, is covered by a structure called the New Safe Confinement, an enormous steel arch, 108 meters high, 162 meters long. It was completed in 2016, 30 years after the explosion. It will need to last 100 years, while the radioactive material inside decays to safer levels. The material inside is called the elephant's foot. It is a mass of melted reactor core, concrete, sand, and other materials that fused together during the disaster. It is still radioactive. It will remain dangerous for thousands of years. Standing next to it for 5 minutes would deliver a fatal dose. Nobody stands next to it. The question that stays. 3 men walked into a flooded basement in the dark, into water contaminated with radiation, with dosimeters that couldn't measure how bad it was, with no guarantee of what would happen to them afterward. They did this because someone had to, because the physics was simple, because the alternative was millions of people whose water would be gone, whose cities would be gone, whose children would grow up somewhere else if they were lucky enough to grow up at all. The 3 men did not make a speech. They put on wetsuits and picked up flashlights and walked down the stairs into the water. The thing about ordinary people, every account of Chernobyl eventually arrives at the same place. The disaster was caused by systems, by bureaucracies, by design flaws and institutional secrecy, and the Soviet culture of reporting upward that everything was fine when it was not. But the disaster was stopped, or at least reduced from something almost incomprehensible to something merely catastrophic, by individuals. By Ananenko, knowing where the valves were, by Bespalov and Baranov not letting him go alone, by helicopter pilots who flew the route they were told to fly, by liquidators who showed up for their 90-second shifts, by Legasov, who told the truth in Vienna and recorded the rest of the truth on tapes in his apartment and paid for it with everything he had. The ending. They walked into a place that was trying to kill them, not because they were fearless, not because they didn't understand the risk. They understood exactly what the radiation would do to a human body. They went anyway, because someone had to, because the valves were down there and they knew where they were, because their colleagues were going, and you don't let your colleagues go alone. The world did not end in the spring of 1986. The water was drained. The explosion did not happen. Europe did not become uninhabitable, and most people alive today have no idea how close it was, or who stopped it. Now you do.